I am Richard Caldwell, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my own flesh and blood inflicted. As a self-made real estate mogul in Dallas, I thought I had built a legacy to protect my family forever. But after a brutal car crash left me bedridden, my son and his wife stood over my hospital bed smirking. They told me they could not take care of me, claiming their luxury vacation came first. I simply nodded through the pain and smiled. That very same day, I hired a private nurse, disabled their supplementary credit cards, and stopped their $15,000 monthly allowance. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a hard lesson to family who mistook your generosity for weakness. The rhythmic, agonizing beep of an EKG monitor was the first thing that anchored my consciousness back to reality. Each sharp sound felt like a heavy hammer striking against the inside of my skull. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of a Dallas emergency room. The air was heavy and thick, with the sterile metallic scent of bleach and rubbing alcohol. My entire body felt as though it had been crushed under the weight of a runaway freight train. In a literal sense, it practically had been. A brutal high-speed car crash on Interstate 35 had left me with a completely shattered right femur and 4 deeply cracked ribs. Every single breath I took was a sharp, jagged stab of white-hot pain radiating through my chest. I was entirely immobilized, trapped beneath a chaotic mess of clear intravenous tubes, heavy white plaster casts, and elevated vital monitors. I had spent 40 long, relentless years building a commercial real estate and logistics empire from the ground up. I had clawed my way from absolute nothing to the very top of the Texas business world through pure grit and determination. I was deeply accustomed to being the man in total control, the man who gave the sharp orders, fixed the impossible problems, and protected everyone under his roof. Now, at 70 years old, I found myself reduced to absolute helplessness, relying entirely on a slow drip of liquid morphine just to endure the sheer physical agony of existing in that narrow hospital bed. The heavy, soundproof wooden door to my private recovery room swung open with a quiet click. I slowly turned my head, wincing, as the stiff, bruised muscles in my neck loudly protested the movement. My only son, Derek, who was 38 years old, walked into the room. He was followed closely by his 35-year-old wife, Stephanie. For a brief, incredibly foolish second, the deeply buried heart of a father swelled with a sudden rush of hopeful relief. I naively expected a frantic rush of hurried footsteps toward my bedside. I expected desperate questions about my level of pain, genuine tears of deep concern, and the warm, comforting grasp of a son holding his vulnerable father's hand after a terrifying near-death experience. I received absolutely nothing of the sort. Derek stopped near the foot of my bed, deliberately keeping a cool, calculated physical distance between us. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask what the team of trauma doctors had said about my long-term prognosis. Instead, he aggressively pulled back the crisp white cuff of his custom-tailored Italian dress shirt and impatiently checked his heavy Rolex. It was the exact same solid gold luxury watch I had purchased for him to celebrate his birthday 2 years ago. He stared down at the expensive dial with an expression of profound, unfiltered inconvenience. Stephanie stood slightly behind his right shoulder, her arms tightly crossed over her immaculate designer silk blouse. She was visibly annoyed, her face slightly scrunched up in disgust, as if the very air of the trauma ward was deeply offending her delicate sensibilities. She kept shifting her weight from side to side in her expensive high heels, her eyes darting around the room, looking anywhere but directly at my bruised and battered face. "Dad," Derek finally spoke. His voice was entirely flat and completely devoid of any recognizable human emotion. He sounded exactly like he was addressing a slightly bothersome client who had dared to show up at his office without a scheduled appointment. "The surgical doctors just caught us out in the hallway. They told us all about the emergency femur reconstruction. They said you are going to need 24/7 professional care for at least the next 2 full months just to manage basic daily tasks." I swallowed dryly, my throat feeling like rough sandpaper. Yes, I managed to whisper out, my voice sounding incredibly raspy and alarmingly weak to my own ears. It is going to be a very long and difficult road to recovery. I am going to need some serious help getting everything properly set up at the main house. Derek let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh, running a perfectly manicured hand through his styled hair. Listen, Dad, we simply cannot stay here with you today, and we absolutely cannot take on this massive responsibility right now. It is just terrible timing for us. I blinked slowly, the heavy fog of the pain medication making me wonder if I had somehow misheard the words coming out of my own son's mouth. Terrible timing. I had just miraculously survived a horrific head-on collision that had nearly snapped my spine in half, and my son was calling my survival terrible timing. We have our scheduled first-class flight to Aspen early tomorrow morning. Derek continued smoothly, his tone hardening with visible irritation. It is a highly crucial make-or-break investor meeting for my new tech startup. You know exactly how hard I have been working for the past year to get these elusive venture capitalists to sit down at a table with me. We absolutely cannot cancel this trip under any circumstances. It is a literal matter of life and death for the future of my company. Our vacation, well, our critical business trip simply has to come first. I lay there, silently staring up at the son I had raised. For 3 entire years, I had been blindly transferring $15,000 every single month directly into his accounts to fund this supposed brilliant tech startup. I had single-handedly funded his lavish daily life, paid the enormous down payment on his luxury home, and bought his high-performance cars. I had willingly given him every possible advantage a father could provide in this world. And now, as I lay physically broken and bleeding in a hospital bed, he could not even spare a single weekend to ensure the man who funded his reality was safe and cared for. Stephanie confidently stepped forward, her sharp heels clicking loudly and obnoxiously against the pristine linoleum hospital floor. She looked down at me with a perfectly cold, unapologetic smirk resting on her lips. Derek is completely right, Richard. You know how vastly important this specific networking trip is for our long-term future. Besides, you are an incredibly wealthy man. You certainly do not lack the endless financial resources to simply figure this minor setback out yourself. Hire a private concierge nurse. Hire a whole medical team of them if you really have to. But our future success must come first. We cannot be expected to put our busy lives on hold just because you happened to have an unfortunate accident. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her cruel words hung heavily in the sterile, quiet air of the recovery room. She was openly telling the man who directly subsidized her entire luxurious existence that his suffering was nothing more than an irritating burden to her schedule. Well, Derek said briskly, clapping his hands together one single time as if officially concluding a brief, highly unproductive board meeting. We really need to go back to the house and finish packing our luggage. The private driver is picking us up precisely at dawn. Just have the hospital nurses call our cell phones if anything major changes with your condition, all right? Get well soon, Dad. Without waiting even a second for any sort of response, they simultaneously turned their backs on me. They walked straight out the door, deliberately, leaving it slightly ajar, their rapid footsteps echoing down the long hospital hallway as they hurried back to their perfect, completely unbothered lives. They left me utterly alone, trapped inside a broken shell of a body. For several long, agonizing minutes, there was absolutely nothing but the steady, mocking beep of the heart monitor to keep me company. In a different life, or perhaps for a different type of man, this would undoubtedly be the moment to openly weep. This would be the devastating moment a 70-year-old father would finally break down in deep, inconsolable sorrow, mournfully regretting the utter failure of his parenting and the spectacularly cruel abandonment by his only living child. But I did not weep. I did not shed a single tear. As the heavy door finally swung shut on its own, the initial paralyzing shock slowly drained completely out of my system, leaving behind something much more potent and infinitely more dangerous. A deep, cold, calculating, and absolute rage settled into my bones. The exact same ruthless predator-like business instincts that had allowed me to utterly crush my corporate competitors and build a massive real estate empire over the last 4 decades instantly kicked into overdrive. If my son genuinely wanted to treat my life and well-being as a minor bothersome business transaction, then I was more than ready to fluently speak his chosen language. I forced my only good, uninjured arm to reach out toward the small rolling tray table positioned right beside my bed. With a sharp grimace of intense pain, I somehow managed to stretch far enough to firmly grab my iPad. I desperately needed to see exactly how crucial this supposed high-stakes investor meeting in Aspen really was. I unlocked the glowing screen and quickly opened my primary email account, which was directly connected to all of my high-level financial security alerts. Before I could even attempt to search the inbox for Derek's corporate startup details, a bright red priority notification suddenly popped up directly at the very top of the tablet screen. It was an automated high-priority security alert straight from American Express. A massive financial charge had just been successfully processed on the exclusive supplementary black card that I had personally provided to Derek specifically, and only for dire business emergencies. I slowly tapped the glowing notification, my tired eyes narrowing sharply as the digital itemized receipt quickly loaded on the bright screen. The approved charge was for exactly $40,000. The listed merchant was an elite, highly exclusive luxury jewelry boutique, located directly in the very heart of the upscale shopping district of Aspen, Colorado. And the digital timestamp on the transaction clearly showed that the massive purchase had been fully authorized exactly 3 minutes after Derek and Stephanie had walked out of my hospital room. A struggling tech startup founder seeking vital seed money does not casually buy $40,000 worth of fine diamonds for a serious venture capital meeting. The plausible, neatly packaged lie had just violently cracked wide open right in front of my eyes. My own son was not just callously abandoning me in my darkest hour of need. He was actively and joyfully bleeding me dry. And he was arrogant and foolish enough to actually use my own hard-earned money to do it while I was still breathing. I firmly locked the tablet screen and stared straight up at the bland white ceiling tiles. The burning pain in my shattered leg was completely forgotten, entirely eclipsed by a cold, burning determination. They genuinely thought I was just a helpless, clueless old man. They thought I was a bottomless, silent bank account that would simply endure their blatant disrespect forever. They had severely and fatally miscalculated. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing tablet screen, the harsh light illuminating the quiet corners of my hospital room. $40,000. I read the notification again, letting the sheer absurdity of the number sink into my mind. The merchant name was displayed as an exclusive appointment, only luxury jeweler nestled in the snow-covered peaks of Aspen. My son had claimed that he was flying out to secure vital funding from conservative angel investors for his struggling software startup. I have spent my adult life navigating the highest, most cutthroat echelons of corporate America. I have negotiated multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deals across the globe. I know exactly how venture capital meetings operate. You might buy a prospective investor an expensive steak dinner, or perhaps a rare bottle of vintage wine to grease the wheels of a tough negotiation. You do not, under any conceivable circumstances, purchase a $40,000 diamond necklace to close a software deal. It made absolutely no logical sense. The crisp, tailored facade my son had presented just moments ago was rapidly unraveling right before me. This was not a desperate entrepreneur trying to save his business. This was a man indulging in a massive, impulsive shopping spree using funds that did not belong to him. The audacity of executing that transaction within 3 minutes of leaving my bleeding body in a trauma ward was almost impressive in its pure sociopathy. I needed to see more to dig deeper into the complex financial architecture of his daily life. I placed my uninjured hand flat against the firm hospital mattress and pushed down, forcing my torso into an upright sitting position. A blinding flash of agony instantly tore through my fractured ribs, stealing the breath directly from my lungs. My shattered leg throbbed with a sickening pulse, violently protesting the sudden shift in my center of gravity. I clenched my jaw tight, swallowing a bitter groan of physical misery. Strangely enough, I welcomed the sharp physical pain. It grounded me. It cleared the lingering haze of the heavy painkillers from my brain. I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows, carefully balancing the tablet on my chest. As I waited for the banking application to load, my mind automatically began to crunch the historical numbers. For the past 24 consecutive months, I had been transferring a flat $15,000 every single month to Derek to cover the operational overhead of his tech company. That was $360,000 in pure liquid cash. Add in the massive down payment I provided for his sprawling Highland Park mansion, the 2 luxury European cars sitting in his driveway, and the countless minor financial bailouts I had authorized to keep his extravagant lifestyle afloat. I had handed my son well over $2 million since he formally graduated college. I had done it out of a misplaced sense of paternal duty, sincerely hoping to give him the sturdy foundation I never had when I was building my empire. But looking at the recent jewelry receipt, I realized the terrible truth. I had not built a foundation for a successful businessman. I had built a golden, impenetrable cage for a greedy parasite. I navigated directly to the corporate portal on my tablet, fully intending to review the master ledger for his startup. Since I had provided the entirety of the initial seed capital, I was legally listed as a 51% majority shareholder, which meant I had absolute unrestricted access to the company financial records. I carefully typed in my secure administrative credentials and pressed enter. The screen buffered for a long, agonizing moment before flashing a stark red error message. Access denied. User privileges revoked. I frowned deeply, meticulously retyping the complex password, assuming my heavily medicated brain had simply made a minor typographical error. Access denied. A cold, heavy sensation began to spread rapidly through my stomach, completely independent of my physical injuries. I quickly tried to access the secondary payroll accounts, the vendor payment portals, and the primary business credit lines. Every single digital door had been firmly slammed shut and padlocked. Then a distinct, unsettling memory floated to the surface of my mind. About 3 weeks ago, during one of our brief Sunday family dinners, Derek had casually mentioned that his chief technology officer was conducting a massive server migration. He had smoothly explained that the accounting portals would be temporarily offline for routine security updates, and that my administrative access might be glitchy for a few days. I had nodded along, sipping my wine, completely trusting the word of my only child. I had been an absolute fool. There was no server migration. There were no routine software security updates. It was a calculated, deliberate smokescreen designed to quietly strip me of my financial oversight. My son had systematically locked the majority shareholder out of the company books, likely because those books contained a devastating truth he could not afford for me to ever see. The terrible betrayal was no longer just a lingering suspicion. It was a confirmed reality. My breathing grew shallow, restricted by the tight bandages wrapping my chest, but my mind was racing with terrifying clarity. If Derek had meticulously locked me out of the corporate accounts, what else had he secretly touched? What other legal boundaries had he crossed, while I was blindly trusting him with the master keys to my kingdom? I swiftly closed the corporate application and forcefully opened my primary personal banking portal. This was the highly secure digital vault that held the vast majority of my liquid personal wealth, my retirement funds, and the massive family trust I had established decades ago. I bypassed the standard password login and utilized the biometric scanner, pressing my thumb firmly against the glass screen. The financial dashboard loaded immediately, displaying the figures I had accumulated through decades of blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. At first glance, the total account balance appeared relatively normal. But as my eyes scanned steadily downward toward the recent daily activity log, my heart suddenly slammed violently against my cracked ribs. There, sitting right at the top of the ledger, was a highly unusual transaction marked in bright orange warning lettering. It was a massive pending wire transfer, quietly initiated just one single hour ago, patiently waiting for final clearing from the senior bank manager. The requested amount was a staggering $200,000. I stared at the bold, unforgiving numbers, my mouth going completely dry. I tapped directly on the pending transaction to clearly view the routing details and the attached authorization notes. The destination account belonged solely and entirely to Derek. But it was the brief typed justification attached directly to the wire that made the warm blood freeze entirely in my veins. The digital form read exactly, "Emergency medical proxy withdrawal for Richard Caldwell." My son was not just callously leaving me alone to suffer in a hospital bed. He was actively using the horrific tragedy of my near-fatal car accident as a highly convenient, perfectly timed excuse to rob me blind while I was bleeding. I stared at the glowing words on the tablet screen, feeling a cold, unnatural calm wash entirely over my broken body. There was absolutely no room left in my mind for grief or sorrow. Grief is a useless luxury reserved for men who are not actively under siege. Every single breath I took reminded me of my mortality, but my spirit was rapidly hardening into solid iron. I reached up with my good hand and brutally yanked the plastic oxygen tube from my nostrils, tossing it carelessly aside. I did not bother to press the plastic nurse call button hanging by my bed. I certainly did not attempt to dial my son, to scream at him, or demand a pathetic, tearful explanation for his actions. Confrontation without proper preparation is the fastest way to lose a war, and my only child had just silently declared war against me. Instead, I opened my phone contacts and tapped the name of the only man in Dallas who truly matched my own immense capacity for professional ruthlessness. Mitchell Harrison was not just my primary corporate attorney. He was a vicious legal shark who had spent the last 2 decades aggressively tearing apart my competitors and shielding my real estate empire from every conceivable threat. He was a man who slept with his cell phone resting on his chest, always waiting for the faint scent of blood in the water. He answered on the exact second ring, his voice crisp, alert, and entirely devoid of any meaningless pleasantries. I bypassed any mention of my shattered leg, my cracked ribs, or the bleak hospital room entirely. I desperately needed him to operate with absolute clinical precision. I commanded him to pull up my master financial portfolio immediately. I listened closely to the rapid, familiar clacking of his mechanical keyboard echoing through the small phone speaker. "Mitchell," I said, my voice steady and hard despite the searing, persistent pain flaring in my chest. "There is a pending withdrawal request for $200,000 currently sitting in the primary family trust. I need you to contact the senior bank manager and freeze that transaction right this exact second. Claim suspected elder fraud and lock the vault. Next, I want you to locate the recurring automated wire transfer of $15,000 that goes out on the 1st of every single month to Derek's software company. Terminate that routing protocol permanently. Finally, access my personal credit portal and instantly kill every single supplementary black card issued under my name. I want them flagged as stolen and completely deactivated by the time I finish speaking this sentence." Mitchell did not pause to ask unnecessary questions. He did not ask how my son was involved or why I was suddenly cutting off my own flesh and blood. He simply executed the severe commands with the lethal, unquestioning efficiency I paid him so handsomely for. I heard him dialing his dedicated banking liaison on a secondary line, his tone dropping into a demanding, highly authoritative cadence that left absolutely no room for bureaucratic hesitation or banking delays. In less than 3 minutes, the heavy steel doors of my financial fortress were violently slammed shut and triple locked. Derek and his arrogant wife were now completely and permanently cut off from my wealth. While I waited in silence for Mitchell to confirm the digital executions, a deep, highly unsettling memory began to claw its way up through the lingering, heavy fog of the medical narcotics. I closed my eyes tightly, forcing myself to mentally rewind to the chaotic, blinding hours of my initial admission to the emergency trauma room. I vividly remembered the blinding overhead fluorescent lights rushing past my vision as the paramedics swiftly wheeled my stretcher through the swinging double doors. I remembered the sharp, stinging scent of surgical antiseptic and the terrifying, breathless agony radiating endlessly from my crushed leg. But most prominently, I remembered Derek. He had not been standing back against the wall giving the rushing trauma surgeons the necessary room to work and save my life. Instead, he had been hovering aggressively close to my bed, his face pale and unusually tense. At one specific point, just as the trauma nurse had injected the first heavy dose of liquid morphine directly into my intravenous line, Derek had leaned heavily over me. He had brought another man directly to my bedside. The strange man was wearing a pristine white coat, holding a glowing digital tablet in his hands. I had naturally assumed in my heavily drugged and panicked state that the man was an attending physician requiring my immediate legal consent for the emergency femur surgery. Derek had firmly grasped my right hand. He had gently, but persistently, guided my heavy, uncoordinated thumb directly onto the digital biometric scanner of the tablet. I remembered his voice sounding strangely urgent and breathless, telling me it was just routine admission paperwork that required my immediate thumbprint to proceed with the surgery. I had been far too delirious and consumed by pain to read the fine print displayed on the glowing screen. My eyes snapped open in the quiet hospital room, the puzzle pieces suddenly locking together with terrifying crystal-clear precision. That man in the white coat was absolutely no doctor. My son had deliberately used my moments of pure physical agony and chemical vulnerability to secure my digital fingerprint on something far more sinister than routine hospital intake forms. The sharp sound of Mitchell clearing his throat brought my intense focus back to the telephone. The immediate bleed has been successfully stopped. Richard, he reported, his voice unusually tight, with an unfamiliar tension. The massive withdrawal request is officially frozen, pending a thorough fraud investigation, and every single supplementary credit card is now effectively a piece of useless plastic. But as I was permanently terminating the monthly recurring wire transfer, I found a massive glaring anomaly in the digital routing protocol. I gripped the phone tighter, bracing myself for the inevitable blow. "Tell me exactly what you see," I demanded. Mitchell let out a low, highly frustrated breath. "You explicitly told me you were sending that $15,000 to a domestic corporate payroll account for a local Dallas software startup. But that is not where those funds are landing. Derek has been utilizing a highly sophisticated series of digital routing layers to bounce the monthly money through multiple domestic shell companies to hide the trail. The final destination for your money is an offshore holding account registered to an anonymous limited liability corporation in the Cayman Islands. Your son does not have a struggling tech startup, Richard. He has constructed an elaborate, highly illegal money laundering funnel." The heavy silence in my hospital room felt suddenly suffocating. This was no longer just a family dispute. It was an active crime scene, and I was the prime target. The entire situation had just drastically escalated from a simple case of familial greed into a massive federal crime with my name unknowingly attached to the primary funding source. "I need a full, completely unredacted audit of his entire digital footprint," I told Mitchell, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Mitchell did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. "I am deploying my absolute best elite forensic cyber team right now," he promised firmly. "They are going to digitally rip his entire fake company apart piece by piece, and we will find out exactly what your son is really doing in the dark." Mitchell works fast. Less than an hour after our highly intense phone call, the heavy wooden door to my private hospital room swung open. A tall, sharply dressed woman with an athletic build and an intense, unwavering gaze stepped confidently inside the sterile environment of the medical facility. She introduced herself as Sarah Jenkins, a private medical contractor and a former military nurse whom Mitchell kept on an exclusive retainer for high-profile clients. Sarah did not wear a standard set of scrubs or carry a plastic clipboard like the regular staff. She moved with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of a trained soldier entering a hostile zone. Her first action was to dismiss the gossiping floor nurses and completely lock down my recovery room. She expertly adjusted my intravenous lines, checked my vital monitors, and established a strict, unyielding perimeter right at my doorway. Nobody was getting through that door without my explicit authorization. For the first time since the devastating car crash, I felt a genuine sense of control returning to my broken body. I might have been physically immobilized, confined to a rigid hospital mattress, with a shattered femur and aching ribs, but my mind was remarkably sharp and highly focused. Supported by Sarah's vigilant protection and Mitchell's ruthless legal maneuvering, I was effectively operating my vast commercial real estate empire directly from my bed. The heavy fog of the morphine was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, searing adrenaline. I requested a secure, encrypted laptop from Mitchell, and Sarah had it delivered within the hour. I spent the early afternoon meticulously changing every master password, revoking every administrative access token, and digitally barricading the immense wealth I had spent 4 decades building. The trap was set, and the immense digital vault was permanently sealed against the 2 ungrateful thieves. Exactly 7 hours after Mitchell completely severed the financial lifelines, the inevitable fallout finally began to unfold in real time. I had placed my personal cell phone on the small tray table beside my bed, leaving the volume on the highest setting. The device vibrated and chimed with a sudden violent urgency. The glowing screen displayed my son's name. I simply watched the phone ring until it diverted to voicemail. A minute later, the device lit up again. Then came a third call, followed rapidly by a fourth. The frequency of the calls escalated with a desperate, frantic rhythm that echoed loudly throughout the quiet room. 10 missed calls turned into 30. 30 missed calls quickly multiplied into 99. Dozens of lengthy, panicked text messages began to flood my notification screen, alternating constantly between my son and his wife. The initial texts were confused and slightly annoyed, asking if I had carelessly forgotten to pay the monthly credit card bills before my sudden accident. But as the hours dragged on, the messages morphed into pure, unfiltered terror. Derek texted that his premium black card had just been publicly declined at the front desk of their 5-star luxury resort in Aspen. Stephanie followed up with a furious message complaining that they were being threatened with immediate eviction from their penthouse suite because the front desk could not secure a valid payment method for their extravagant room service charges. They were stranded in an elite mountain town surrounded by immense wealth, without a single functioning penny to their names to purchase even a basic meal. The bottomless bank account they had continuously taken for granted had suddenly and inexplicably vanished. I watched the mounting digital panic with a steady, unblinking gaze, refusing to touch the screen or offer them a single word of comfort. Sarah approached my bed with a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. She handed it to me with a respectful nod, her eyes briefly scanning the continuously flashing screen of my phone before turning away. I brought the hot mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip to calm my highly frayed nerves. The rich, bitter taste of the coffee grounded me, providing a stark contrast to the emotional whirlwind spinning inside my chest. As I listened to the relentless buzzing of the phone, my thoughts drifted painfully back to my late wife, Mary. I vividly remembered her sitting across from me at our expansive mahogany dining table, her delicate hands securely wrapped around a similar mug of fresh coffee. Mary had always possessed an incredibly sharp intuition when it came to human nature. She had frequently warned me that my financial leniency toward our only child was a grave mistake. She used to tell me that shielding a young man from the harsh realities of consequence would only breed a spoiled, dangerous monster disguised as a loving son. I had foolishly dismissed her wise concerns, arguing that my immense success meant our family should never have to struggle. I wanted to give him the seamless, privileged life that I had to fight and bleed for every single day of my youth. Now trapped in a sterile trauma ward while my son enjoyed a stolen luxury vacation, I finally understood the profound depth of my error. My unchecked generosity had not nurtured a capable successor. It had simply fed a greedy, entitled parasite who viewed my love as a weakness to be endlessly exploited. The bitter coffee felt like a highly fitting, well-deserved remedy for my years of blind paternal ignorance and misplaced trust. The buzzing of the phone eventually faded into a quiet, defeated silence as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the hospital floor. Just as the ambient light began to dim significantly, the heavy door to my room opened. Mitchell Harrison walked in, his tailored suit completely immaculate, his face set in a grim, stony expression that immediately commanded deep respect. Sarah immediately stepped aside silently, acknowledging the powerful attorney before taking up a secure, watchful position near the glass window. Mitchell approached the foot of my bed, carrying a thick, heavy red dossier tightly under his left arm. He did not offer a polite greeting or ask about my pain levels. We were far past the point of casual pleasantries. He placed the dense folder down on the rolling tray table directly in front of me. The bright red cover seemed to glow ominously under the harsh hospital lighting. I looked up at my attorney, silently demanding the truth. Richard Mitchell said, his deep, resonant voice slicing through the quiet room with absolute unyielding certainty. My cyber team breached the Cayman Islands servers and fully audited the software company records. There is no startup. The entire enterprise is a meticulously constructed ghost operation designed solely to funnel your monthly capital into his private reserves. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, absorbing the heavy confirmation of my worst fears. But Mitchell was not finished. He placed his large hand flat on top of the red dossier and leaned closer to my bed. "That fake company is the least of your problems, Richard," he continued, his tone dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "You need to open this file right now. Look at what my private investigator just pulled from the snowy streets of Aspen." Mitchell flipped the heavy red cover of the dossier open. He did not speak immediately, allowing the grim reality of the printed documents to establish the tone in the sterile hospital room. The first section of the file was a comprehensive audit report prepared by his elite cyber team over the past few hours. Mitchell pointed a steady finger at the bold summary printed on the first page. The tech startup that my son had passionately pitched to me 2 years ago, the highly innovative software company that supposedly required $15,000 a month to maintain its critical operational overhead, simply did not exist in any functional capacity. Mitchell explained with a clinical precision that the entire digital infrastructure was nothing more than a hollow facade. The cyber team had completely breached the company's servers and found absolutely 0 lines of proprietary code. There were no active product development logs, no secure client databases, and certainly no busy teams of remote software engineers drawing a monthly salary from my continuous cash infusions. The slick corporate website that Derek had proudly shown me on his tablet was a cheap generic template purchased for a few dollars on the internet. It was populated with completely fabricated employee profiles featuring stolen stock photographs. It was a digital ghost ship specifically engineered to look just legitimate enough to pass a casual inspection by a trusting father. I stared at the financial audit, my chest tightening with a profound, suffocating mixture of absolute disbelief and rising fury. My son had not just made a few poor business decisions or suffered a string of unfortunate entrepreneurial failures. He had deliberately constructed an elaborate, highly calculated financial mirage, strictly designed to systematically drain my wealth. He had sat across from me at our family dining table, looking me directly in the eye, and enthusiastically described software updates and complex marketing strategies that were entirely fictitious. But as Mitchell had just warned me, the fraudulent software company was truly the very least of my rapidly escalating problems. With a heavy sigh, the seasoned attorney reached back into the thick red dossier and pulled out a stack of high-resolution color-printed photographs. He tossed them casually onto my lap, right over the stiff white hospital blankets, covering my shattered legs. The glossy images scattered across my chest, instantly drawing my gaze down to the horrifying visual evidence collected by Mitchell's private investigator, currently operating in the snowy mountains of Colorado. The photographs were brutally clear, taken with a high-powered telephoto lens from a very close, highly advantageous vantage point. I picked up the first image with my trembling, uninjured hand. My son was indeed in Aspen. The background of the photo displayed a pristine snow-covered ski resort, bathed in the bright morning sunlight. But Derek was absolutely not sitting in a stuffy professional boardroom, desperately pitching a software presentation to conservative angel investors. He was lounging comfortably on an exclusive private outdoor terrace wearing expensive designer ski gear that I had undoubtedly paid for with my own hard-earned wealth. A massive silver bucket filled with ice and an empty bottle of premium vintage champagne sat prominently on the rustic wooden table directly in front of him, serving as a glittering monument to his unbelievable financial arrogance and pure, unadulterated selfishness. I forced myself to look closely at the second photograph in the stack. Derek was not alone on that luxurious sunlit terrace. He was standing intimately close to a strikingly beautiful young woman who could not have been a single day over 22 years old. She was wearing a glamorous, highly impractical winter outfit, laughing brightly as she leaned heavily against my son's chest. But it was the third photograph that made the bitter taste of bile rise sharply in the back of my throat. The image captured the exact sickening moment my son finalized the $40,000 transaction that had triggered my banking security alerts earlier that morning. Derek was standing directly behind the young woman, smiling a completely carefree, arrogant smile. He was in the precise, delicate motion of carefully fastening a massive glittering diamond necklace around her slender neck. I stared at the photographic evidence of his blatant infidelity and profound financial treachery. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect radiated from every single pixel of the glossy paper. My son was joyfully parading his illicit young mistress around one of the most expensive resort towns in the world, casually draped in tens of thousands of dollars worth of fine jewelry, all while operating under the direct assumption that I was lying broken and helpless in a hospital bed, blissfully ignorant of his crimes. The utter lack of any basic human empathy or simple moral decency was absolutely staggering. A sudden sharp wave of intense confusion forcefully pierced through the thick, blinding veil of my absolute rage. I lowered the photograph of the diamond necklace and looked up at my attorney, my brow furrowing deeply. If Derek is publicly parading a young mistress around the crowded terraces of Aspen right this very second, I asked, my voice barely above a harsh, strained whisper then, where exactly is his wife? Where is Stephanie? I tried to piece together the fractured logic of the situation. I had personally watched Derek and Stephanie walk out of this very hospital room together just a handful of hours ago. They had explicitly claimed they were rushing to the airport to catch their private flight to Colorado as a united couple. Had my son simply abandoned his own wife at the airport terminal? Had they flown to the ski resort together, only for Derek to coldly leave her sitting alone in their expensive hotel suite, while he publicly flaunted his secret young girlfriend in broad daylight? I had always viewed Stephanie as a slightly spoiled, overly demanding woman who enjoyed the luxurious comforts my wealth provided, but I had never actively wished her any profound emotional harm. For a brief, highly confusing moment, a small sliver of genuine paternal sympathy for my daughter-in-law actually flickered to life in the dark corners of my chest. Perhaps Stephanie was an unwitting victim in this horrific disaster. Perhaps she was completely blind to her husband's double life and was currently suffering the exact same brutal, agonizing betrayal that I was experiencing in this hospital bed. Mitchell did not say a single comforting word in response to my hesitant, questioning defense of my daughter-in-law. He did not offer any sympathetic theories or hopeful alternative explanations for her glaring physical absence in the photographs. Instead, the seasoned attorney simply let out a low, dark, grim sigh. He reached deliberately past my shoulder and firmly gripped the thick red edge of the dossier resting on the rolling table. He slowly flipped the glossy photographs over, turning to the very next page in the dense investigative file. It was a newly printed transcript of deeply encrypted text messages, carefully extracted directly from her own personal mobile device just moments ago. Stephanie is not a victim, Seward. Mitchell said, his voice completely devoid of any mercy at all. She is the architect, I silently stared at the seasoned attorney, my mind struggling to process the impossible weight of his statement. Mitchell did not offer any further verbal explanation. He simply pulled a thick stack of printed text message transcripts from the back of the red dossier and placed them directly onto my lap, right over the glossy photographs of my son and his young mistress. The pages were filled with highlighted digital conversations, extracted seamlessly from my daughter-in-law's personal device. I picked up the first page with a trembling hand, my eyes scanning the harsh black text printed against the stark white paper. The messages dated back over 2 full years. They were not the words of a betrayed wife discovering her husband's infidelity. They were the cold, highly calculated negotiations of a ruthless business transaction. Stephanie had discovered the 22-year-old girl entirely on her own long before I ever had a single suspicion. But instead of confronting my son with divorce papers or shedding a single tear of heartbreak, she had cornered him with a vicious, unyielding ultimatum. I read a specific exchange from last December, right around the time we gathered around my grand dining table for our traditional holiday dinner. Derek had messaged Stephanie complaining that his young girlfriend was demanding an expensive winter getaway to the snowy slopes of Colorado. Stephanie's typed response was absolutely chilling in its pure sociopathic detachment. She wrote that he could take the girl to the ski resort without any arguments, but only if he immediately transferred $7,500 into her private offshore account by midnight. She explicitly referred to the money as her monthly silence fee, a permanent tax on his disgusting behavior. The deeper I read into the printed transcripts, the more the sickening depths of their arrangement became painfully clear. My son and his wife had forged a deeply toxic, parasitic pact, heavily built entirely upon the vast wealth I had spent my entire adult life accumulating. Stephanie willfully allowed Derek to siphon my money to fund his reckless double life with the young Instagram model. In direct exchange for her absolute silence and her flawless portrayal of the perfect loving daughter-in-law during our Sunday family dinners, Derek funnels exactly half of his $15,000 monthly startup allowance directly into her hidden financial portfolios. I read through endless agonizing pages detailing exactly where my hard-earned money had been going. Stephanie was not using the funds to build a stable foundation for their future together. She was aggressively funding an elite, superficial existence that she could never genuinely afford on her own. There were extensive conversations discussing massive payments for luxury designer handbags, exclusive European spa retreats in Switzerland, and highly secretive cosmetic surgeries performed by top-tier doctors in Beverly Hills. She had even instructed Derek on exactly which lies to tell me during our weekly phone calls to ensure I kept the financial pipeline wide open. She would write out detailed scripts for him, coaching him on how to sound just stressed enough about his fake software company to trigger my deep paternal instinct to protect and provide. I felt a wave of profound nausea wash entirely over my battered body as the twisted reality took hold. For the last 3 years, my entire family dynamic had been nothing more than a highly coordinated, brilliantly executed theatrical scam designed to bleed me dry. Every single warm hug Stephanie had given me at the front door, every bright smile she had flashed across the dinner table, every time she had lovingly called me Dad, it was all a carefully rehearsed performance. They had looked at my grief over losing my late wife, Mary, and they had seen an easily exploitable weakness. They knew I was desperate to keep my remaining family close after the funeral, and they had mercilessly weaponized my own paternal love to fund their grotesque, hollow lives without a single ounce of remorse. The physical agony radiating from my shattered femur and my broken ribs suddenly felt entirely insignificant compared to the crushing, suffocating weight of this absolute emotional betrayal. I had spent 4 decades ruthlessly fighting off corporate sharks, malicious investors, and aggressive competitors in the unforgiving world of commercial real estate. I had built impenetrable legal walls, complex financial fortresses, and ironclad contracts to protect my empire from external threats. Yet the most dangerous, devastating predators had not come from a rival boardroom or a hostile corporate takeover attempt. They had been sitting right inside my own home, drinking my vintage wine, eating my catered food, and secretly laughing at my foolish, boundless generosity. The sheer humiliation of being so profoundly blind burned like raw acid in the back of my throat, making it incredibly difficult to swallow. I lowered the heavy stack of printed transcripts, letting the thick paper slip through my numb fingers and scatter haphazardly across the sterile hospital bed. I looked up at the blank ceiling, feeling an immense hollow void completely swallow the specific place where my heart used to be. My son was a relentless thief, and my beautiful daughter-in-law was his willing, extortionist accomplice. I was entirely alone in this world, surrounded only by the ghosts of a family that had never truly existed outside of my own wishful imagination. As I lay there, quietly drowning in the dark, suffocating realization of my complete familial isolation, the sudden sharp metallic sound of a heavy brass zipper being pulled aggressively open forcefully shattered the heavy oppressive silence lingering inside the recovery room. I slowly shifted my heavy gaze back down to the foot of my hospital bed. Mitchell had completely put the thick red dossier away and was now reaching deep into the interior breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. The fierce, uncompromising corporate attorney pulled out a small metallic flash drive and held it up directly under the harsh fluorescent lights shining from above. His facial expression had suddenly shifted from cold professional disgust to something far more urgent and incredibly dangerous. He stepped purposefully closer to my bedside, carefully and deliberately plugging the small digital drive directly into the side port of my secured electronic tablet. Richard Mitchell said, his voice lowering into a deadly serious register that immediately commanded my absolute attention and forced me to snap back to the harsh reality of the present moment. I deeply know this emotional betrayal is utterly devastating to process, but we simply do not have the luxury of time to mourn your broken family right now. You need to push the intense grief aside and focus entirely on your physical and financial survival. I personally pulled all the hidden hospital security camera footage from the primary trauma ward yesterday afternoon. He very firmly tapped the bright glowing screen of the tablet, bringing up a grainy black and white video file that showed the chaotic emergency room hallway. You absolutely need to see exactly who that particular man in the white coat really was, the highly suspicious stranger that Derek deliberately brought directly into your private room while you were heavily and completely medicated. Mitchell tapped the center of the glowing tablet screen with his index finger, bringing the silent, grainy black and white security footage to life. The video player displayed the busy emergency trauma hallway captured from a high-angled vantage point mounted securely near the sterile ceiling. I watched with a sickening sense of detachment as my own broken body was violently wheeled through the swinging double doors on a narrow medical stretcher. My clothes were heavily stained with dark patches of blood, and my head was rolling limply against the thin pillows. The trauma nurses were moving with frantic, rehearsed urgency, connecting thick intravenous lines and shouting orders that the silent camera could not capture. But my attention was entirely fixed on the figure of my son. Derek was completely ignoring the frantic medical staff attempting to stabilize my shattered leg and failing vital signs. He was pacing nervously just outside the immediate perimeter of my stretcher. Then, the man in the pristine white coat stepped into the frame. Watching the scene unfold with a clear, sober mind, the subtle inconsistencies in the man's behavior were glaringly obvious. He did not move with the confident, purposeful stride of a highly trained trauma surgeon rushing to evaluate a critical patient. He moved with a hesitant, shifty demeanor, constantly looking over his shoulder toward the hospital entrance. He approached Derek, keeping his head ducked low, and slipped the digital tablet into my son's eager hands. I watched the digital timestamp in the corner of the screen tick forward as Derek leaned heavily over my heavily sedated body, brutally grasping my right wrist and forcing my unresisting thumb flat against the glowing glass scanner. Mitchell hit the pause button the exact second the mysterious man in the white coat turned his body directly toward the overhead security camera. The image froze, capturing the man's face in stark relief. Mitchell placed his fingers on the tablet screen and slowly pulled them apart, drastically zooming in directly on the man's chest area to reveal the hidden truth. The high-definition camera clearly captured the large laminated identification badge clipped securely to his front pocket. My eyes scanned the plastic card, expecting to see a standard medical credential or a hospital department logo. Instead, I saw the highly distinctive, ornate official seal of the state government. The bold black letters printed across the top of the laminated badge did not read medical doctor, nor did they identify him as an emergency room administrator. The bold text clearly identified the nervous man as a fully licensed public notary operating far outside his jurisdiction. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the sterile hospital room as the horrific reality of the situation crashed down upon me. That nervous, shifting man was absolutely not a medical professional tasked with saving my life. He was a corrupt back-alley notary public that Derek had deliberately smuggled into a restricted medical ward. Mitchell stared at me, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles fluttered visibly beneath his skin. Your son certainly did not need your digital thumbprint to authorize emergency orthopedic surgery, Richard. Mitchell explained, his voice dropping into a dark, unforgiving register. He needed an officially witnessed, legally binding biometric signature to completely bypass the standard legal protocols. He paid a corrupt official to stand in a busy trauma ward and legally verify that you were consciously and willingly signing away your entire life. The sheer absolute magnitude of my son's calculated sociopathy finally snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. I had been hovering in the dark, chaotic space between life and death, my veins flooded with massive, incapacitating doses of liquid morphine. I was physically broken, emotionally vulnerable, and completely incapable of understanding basic sentences, let alone complex legal documents. In that exact moment of absolute weakness, Derek had callously manipulated my limp hand to digitally sign a full, durable power of attorney, completely coupled with a comprehensive medical proxy document. My own flesh and blood had actively weaponized the horrific tragedy of my near-fatal car collision to execute a hostile, flawless corporate takeover of my entire existence. The master plan was incredibly sinister in its breathtaking simplicity. Derek and Stephanie were never going to simply drain my domestic bank accounts and flee the country with their stolen money. That petty theft was merely the opening act of a much larger, darker campaign designed to completely erase my autonomy. They intended to take absolute, unrestricted legal control of the massive commercial real estate empire I had spent 40 grueling years building from nothing. They were going to use my shattered femur, my cracked ribs, and the heavy regimen of narcotic painkillers as a highly convenient medical excuse to officially declare me mentally unfit and entirely incompetent to manage my own vast affairs. I could suddenly see the entire nightmare unfolding with crystal clarity. They planned to legally seize my assets, lock me away in a restrictive, high-security private nursing facility under the guise of requiring around-the-clock medical care, and throw away the metaphorical key. I would have absolutely no legal standing, no access to my trusted attorneys, and no financial ability to fight back. I would be effectively buried alive in a highly comfortable, utterly sterile hospital room, while my son and his vicious wife systematically liquidated my life's work to recklessly fund their endless, extravagant fantasies. They would strip my hard-earned legacy down to the bare bones, selling off every single commercial property and residential tower I owned to the highest bidder. I looked up from the frozen video image on the tablet screen, my breathing suddenly growing shallow and tight against my restrictive chest bandages. The cold, unyielding rage that had been steadily building inside my heart finally hardened into pure, unbreakable steel. "We need to invalidate those signatures immediately," I commanded, my voice echoing with a harsh, raspy authority that demanded absolute compliance. "We need to file an emergency injunction to block any legal authority that fraudulent notary attempts to process." Mitchell did not nod or offer a single reassuring smile. His harsh face remained carved from solid granite as he slowly reached into his dark leather briefcase and pulled out his sleek silver laptop. He flipped the screen open, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, relentless speed. He completely bypassed the local hospital network and logged directly into the secured, restricted database for the county recorder's office. The bright, harsh glow of the laptop monitor reflected ominously in the thick lenses of his glasses as he rapidly scanned the incoming legal data. I watched his eyes narrow sharply, completely stopping his frantic typing. The heavy, oppressive silence stretched out endlessly for 10 long, agonizing seconds inside the room. Mitchell finally closed his eyes and let out a long, highly frustrated breath. Richard Mitchell said, his voice entirely hollow and utterly devoid of its usual aggressive confidence. They did not wait for the ink to dry. They filed the power of attorney document with the county clerk exactly 1 hour ago. By early tomorrow morning, they will have the absolute legal authority to completely liquidate your entire life's work. The last lingering trace of paternal sadness completely evaporated from my chest the very second Mitchell spoke those terrifying words. The profound grief that had been heavily weighing down my spirit over the last few hours was instantly vaporized entirely, replaced by a pure, calculating wrath that burned hotter than any physical pain in my shattered body. I was no longer a betrayed father, helplessly mourning the tragic loss of his only son. I was a veteran corporate warlord who had just discovered a lethal enemy actively breaching the outer walls of his financial fortress. The time for quiet reflection and emotional processing was permanently over. It was time to go to war. I looked at the digital clock mounted on the sterile hospital wall. It was nearly midnight, but neither Mitchell nor I had any intention of sleeping. We were going to spend the entire night working feverishly from my hospital bed, meticulously preparing a legal guillotine for Derek and Stephanie. I demanded that Sarah bring us 2 more pots of the strongest black coffee the hospital cafeteria could provide. Mitchell immediately spread his thick legal files across the small rolling tray table, turning my recovery room into a highly secure, heavily fortified tactical command center. The first and most critical objective was to permanently neutralize the forged proxy document before the morning sun rose over Dallas. Mitchell did not wait for standard business hours to begin his aggressive legal assault. He operated with the ruthless, unyielding efficiency that made him the most feared corporate attorney in the state of Texas. He immediately utilized his highly exclusive emergency contacts to wake up a senior federal judge whom he had known for decades. Mitchell rapidly drafted an emergency injunction to completely nullify the fraudulent power of attorney, citing severe medical incapacity and blatant elder fraud. He skillfully attached the undeniable time-stamped security footage of the corrupt public notary sneaking into my trauma ward. He aggressively paired that damning video evidence with sworn medical affidavits from my attending trauma surgeons, clearly documenting the massive, incapacitating doses of surgical morphine flowing through my veins at the exact moment my thumbprint was captured. Mitchell argued forcefully over the secure phone line that any document signed under such extreme medical duress was not just legally invalid, but actively criminal. The federal judge reviewed the digital files from his home office and immediately granted the emergency injunction without a single moment of hesitation. The sweeping judicial order effectively froze the fraudulent proxy, rendering the forged document completely useless before Derek could ever present it to a single bank manager or real estate broker. With my vast corporate empire successfully secured behind an impenetrable legal shield, I shifted my intense focus entirely toward the immediate dismantling of my son's luxurious stolen lifestyle. For the past 3 years, Derek and his vicious wife had been living like royalty, entirely funded by my misplaced generosity and their elaborate sociopathic extortion ring. It was time to brutally sever every single thread of that stolen privilege. I instructed Mitchell to open the primary asset management portal on his laptop. The sprawling $3 million Highland Park mansion that Derek and Stephanie proudly called their home was not legally registered in their names. I had personally provided the entire down payment and structured the deed entirely under a private trust that I solely controlled, intending to eventually gift them the property once they demonstrated true financial maturity. They had clearly failed that test. I authorized Mitchell to immediately contact the director of my private property management firm. I gave the strict, unforgiving order to dispatch a full security team to the Highland Park estate before dawn. They were instructed to physically change every single exterior lock, deactivate the central alarm codes, and place heavy chains across the wrought iron driveway gates. Derek and Stephanie were now officially locked out of the massive mansion they had used to constantly flaunt their unearned wealth to their superficial friends. But I was not finished stripping away their stolen facade. Derek loved to proudly drive his expensive, custom-ordered Porsche to his fake software office, while Stephanie spent her afternoons cruising through high-end shopping districts in a top-tier Mercedes SUV. Both of those luxury European vehicles were leased directly through my primary corporate account, functioning as generous company perks for a son I genuinely believed was working hard to build his future. I logged into the corporate fleet management application and digitally revoked their authorized driver status. I then contacted a private, highly discreet repossession agency that my company frequently utilized for defaulted commercial tenants. I paid them triple their standard emergency rate to immediately locate both vehicles in Aspen and legally impound them before the morning. My son and his cruel wife had callously abandoned me in a trauma ward to suffer alone while they laughed and drank vintage champagne. Now, they were going to wake up in a freezing mountain town without a single penny to their names, without a place to sleep back in Dallas, and without even a vehicle to drive themselves to the airport. I was systematically dismantling the golden cage I had unknowingly built for them, tearing it down to the absolute bare, unforgiving foundation. As Mitchell finalized the aggressive repossession orders and confirmed the mansion lockdown with the security director, my phone suddenly illuminated on the table beside my bed. The relentless, frantic buzzing had started again. I calmly reached over and picked up the device, my eyes scanning the bright screen with a cold, unwavering detachment. It was a new, highly desperate text message from Derek. The tone of his words had completely shifted from annoyed confusion to absolute, unadulterated panic. "Dad," the message read, the digital letters screaming with frantic urgency. "The bank made a massive error. All of our primary accounts are completely locked down, and the hotel manager is threatening to call the local police over our unpaid room charges. We cannot access a single dollar. We packed our bags and are rushing to the Aspen airport right now. We are flying back to Dallas on standby on the first red-eye flight available. Please tell the floor nurses to let us into your hospital room the exact second we arrive. We need your help to fix this disaster." I stared at the desperate, pathetic words glowing on the screen, feeling absolutely no pity or compassion for the treacherous thieves rushing back to Texas. They were not flying back to sit by my side or comfort their injured father. They were flying back because the stolen money had finally run dry, and they desperately needed to manipulate their clueless old man into reopening the financial vault. I slowly raised my uninjured hand and began to type my response with deliberate, methodical precision. I did not unleash my boiling rage or threaten them with the massive legal consequences they were about to face. I simply offered a brief confirmation that their worst nightmare was patiently waiting for them. "Cannot wait to see you, son," I typed, hitting the send button and placing the phone down. The war had only just begun. The morning sun had barely begun to cast its pale light across the Dallas skyline when the heavy wooden door to my private recovery room violently swung open. I had spent the entire night wide awake, carefully reviewing the dense red dossier with Mitchell and preparing the absolute destruction of the two traitors rapidly approaching my location. Sarah Jenkins, my formidable private nurse, stood firmly directly in the center of the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. I gave her a slow, deliberate nod, and she smoothly stepped aside, allowing the trap to fully open. Derek and Stephanie practically stumbled into the sterile hospital room, looking absolutely nothing like the polished, incredibly arrogant socialites who had callously abandoned me just yesterday. They were completely disheveled, panting heavily, and visibly vibrating with a frantic, uncontainable, nervous energy. Derek was wearing a wrinkled designer sweater that smelled faintly of stale airport coffee. His hair, usually styled with immaculate precision, stuck up in awkward, unkempt angles. Stephanie looked even worse. Her expensive makeup was heavily smeared beneath her wide, terrified eyes, and she was clutching her oversized leather handbag against her chest, as if it were a life preserver. I knew exactly what they had endured to get here. Mitchell had ensured that every single one of their primary banking accounts, corporate credit lines, and emergency reserve funds were completely frozen solid. They had undoubtedly been forced to suffer the profound indignity of begging for standby tickets on a miserable, cramped commercial economy flight, completely stripped of the lavish private aviation they had grown so accustomed to enjoying on my dime. They were physically exhausted, emotionally frantic, and completely desperate to regain access to the endless river of wealth they believed they inherently deserved. Before I could even register the pathetic reality of their appearance, the theatrical performance immediately commenced. Derek rushed directly to the side of my hospital bed, his face contorted into a masterful, Oscar-worthy mask of profound filial concern. "Dad," he gasped, his voice shaking, with a perfectly calibrated mixture of relief and panic. "We were so incredibly worried about you. We literally dropped everything the exact second we realized there was a massive problem. We had to abruptly cut the critical angel investor meeting completely short right in the middle of our primary software presentation. It was an absolute disaster, but nothing is more important than your health." Stephanie seamlessly joined the rehearsed production, stepping up directly beside her husband. She reached out with a trembling hand, attempting to gently grasp my uninjured fingers, but I subtly pulled my arm back, leaving her hand hovering awkwardly in the empty air. "Oh, Richard," she whimpered, her voice incredibly soft and laced with a manufactured, breathless anxiety. "It has been an absolute nightmare trying to get back to you." We were sitting in the executive boardroom in Aspen, making incredible progress on the tech startup funding, when the bank suddenly froze absolutely everything without a single warning. Our corporate cards declined, the hotel locked us out, and we could not even pay for a basic taxi to the airport. We thought there had been a massive cyber attack on the family trust, or some kind of terrible financial glitch. I watched Stephanie reach up and carefully dab at the corner of her eye, pretending to wipe away a rogue tear of stress and exhaustion. It was a truly spectacular display of emotional manipulation, a flawless continuation of the 3-year scam they had been running right under my nose. They truly believed I was nothing more than a blind, easily manipulated old fool who would eagerly swallow their fabricated narrative and immediately rush to restore their stolen privileges. They expected me to apologize for the banking error, hand them a new credit card, and praise their remarkable dedication. I did not speak. I did not offer a single word of comfort, nor did I provide the reassuring paternal validation they were so desperately hunting for. I simply rested back against the stiff hospital pillows, maintaining a cold, utterly unreadable stare. The profound silence in the room rapidly thickened, becoming incredibly heavy and suffocating. Derek shifted his weight nervously, his eyes darting frantically between my motionless face and the various medical monitors softly beeping beside my bed. My complete lack of an immediate sympathetic reaction was clearly not part of the script they had hastily written during their miserable economy flight back to Texas. I let them stand there in the suffocating quiet, allowing the immense pressure of their own guilt and deception to slowly crush them. Derek, unable to handle the intense, unbroken silence, predictably began to dig his own grave much deeper. "It was a truly vital meeting, Dad," he rambled, his voice growing slightly higher in pitch as he tried to fill the empty void. "The conservative investors were incredibly impressed with our new domestic routing protocols and the digital migration strategies I have been implementing. I really think we were on the verge of securing a massive influx of external capital that would finally allow the startup to operate entirely independent of your monthly overhead support. It is just such a terrible shame that the sudden banking freeze ruined the momentum." Stephanie quickly nodded in eager agreement, her smeared makeup making her look desperate. "It was devastating, Richard," she added, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. "Derek has been working so incredibly hard on this software launch. He was brilliantly leading the negotiations, making sure every single detail of the corporate presentation was absolutely perfect. He barely had a moment to step out of the boardroom to eat. We were both just so focused on securing the future of the company. I let the poisonous echoes of their lies hang in the sterile air for another long, excruciating minute. The terror in Derek's eyes was now unmistakable as he finally began to realize that his meticulously crafted smokescreen was failing to produce the desired effect. The clueless old man they had secretly mocked and conspired against was entirely gone. I pushed myself up against the firm mattress, completely ignoring the sharp protest of my fractured ribs. I reached out with steady precision toward the rolling tray table stationed securely by my right side. My fingers firmly grasped the thick edges of the bright red dossier that Mitchell had delivered earlier that night. I lifted the file into the air, holding it between us for a brief, agonizing second. Derek and Stephanie stared at the ominous red folder, completely paralyzed by a sudden sense of impending doom. With a swift motion, I violently dropped the heavy dossier directly onto the hard linoleum floor. It landed with a loud, sharp crack right at my son's expensive leather feet. The thick binding burst open, spilling dozens of high-resolution color-printed photographs across the ground, exposing the undeniable visual proof of his infidelity and their massive financial crimes. I locked my cold, unforgiving gaze directly onto Derek's completely horrified face. "How was the fresh snow, Derek?" I asked, my voice echoing with pure, lethal clarity. "Or was the shiny $40,000 diamond necklace too heavy to ski with?" The absolute silence that suddenly flooded the small hospital room was so incredibly profound that I could clearly hear the steady rhythmic hum of my intravenous pump. Derek and Stephanie completely froze in place, their eyes instantly widening in sheer terror as they stared down at the glossy photographs scattered across the cold linoleum floor. The image of Derek clasping the diamond necklace around the neck of his mistress stared right back up at them, serving as undeniable proof of their massive deception. The color rapidly drained from my son's face, leaving him looking pale beneath the fluorescent lights. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then opened it again, resembling a suffocating fish desperately gasping for air. His meticulously tailored facade was shattering right before my eyes. Dada Derek stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine that betrayed his internal panic. "This is not what it looks like at all. You have to listen to me. Those photographs are completely out of context. The girl in the picture is just a marketing consultant we hired for the software startup. We were celebrating a corporate milestone. She insisted on trying on the jewelry as a joke. I swear to you it was just a joke. Someone is trying to set me up." I did not blink, maintaining a cold stare that sliced right through his lies. Before Derek could construct another layer to his narrative, Stephanie suddenly shifted her demeanor. The daughter-in-law routine evaporated instantly. She took a swift step away from Derek, distancing herself from the sinking ship of his deception. She covered her mouth with both hands, unleashing a loud gasp of manufactured heartbreak. "Richard," Stephanie cried out, her voice pitching into a wail of agony. "I am so sickened by this. I had no idea he was doing anything like this behind my back. I swear to you on my life, Richard. He told me he was locked inside the executive boardroom all day working on the software presentation. I have been sitting alone in our hotel suite waiting for my husband to return while he was out flaunting some cheap girl. How could you do this to me, Derek? How could you destroy our marriage?" She turned her eyes toward her husband, slapping him on the shoulder with a display of fury. She was throwing Derek to the wolves, attempting to save her skin and preserve her access to my wealth by playing the wounded wife. Her performance was truly a masterclass in manipulation. If I had not spent the night reading through the files that Mitchell had extracted from her cell phone, I might have believed her. But I already knew the truth. I slowly reached back over to my bedside table. I picked up the heavy stack of transcripts and held them securely in my hand. I let Stephanie finish her monologue before I spoke. "You are a talented actress, Stephanie. I said, my voice echoing with a dark calmness that made her stop crying. But you should learn to permanently delete your backups before you attempt to play the innocent victim in my presence. I raised the top sheet of the paper stack, positioning it perfectly under the reading light above my bed. Let me read you a very interesting conversation from last December. I continued enunciating every single syllable with sharp precision. Derek sent you a message saying his young friend wanted an expensive ski trip, and your exact response was, she can have her little snowy vacation, but only if you immediately transfer $8,000 into my private account for the new Hermes bag I want. Consider it my monthly silence fee. I paused, letting the devastating reality of my words crash heavily over them. I dropped the printed transcript right on top of the photographs. You knew everything, Stephanie. You actively orchestrated the entire arrangement. You traded your silence for expensive designer bags, luxury spa retreats, and endless shopping sprees using my stolen money. The sudden exposure of their parasitic pact hit them like a physical blow. Stephanie completely stopped crying, her dramatic tears vanishing instantly as her face hardened into a cold, vicious scowl. She did not attempt to deny the text messages. She knew Mitchell possessed the undeniable digital forensics to prove every single word. She simply crossed her arms tightly over her chest and glared at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. Derek, realizing that his fake software company, his hidden offshore accounts, and his carefully constructed marriage were all entirely destroyed, suddenly dropped the frightened, stammering son routine. The pathetic panic in his eyes was rapidly replaced by an ugly, aggressive sense of profound entitlement. His true monstrous nature finally ripped through the surface. He stepped directly toward my hospital bed, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson red. "So what if we took the money?" Derek suddenly shouted, his voice echoing loudly and aggressively against the sterile walls of the trauma ward. "You have far too much money anyway. You have hundreds of millions of dollars just sitting completely useless in your corporate accounts, while you refuse to step down and let me run the empire. You never let me make any real decisions. You always treated me like a child, making me beg for every single dollar to build a life. We deserved that money, Dad. You owe us this luxurious lifestyle. You owe me the empire you promised. You spent your entire life aggressively hoarding wealth and working yourself into an early grave. We simply took what was already rightfully ours. You owe us everything we took." I stared directly into the eyes of the greedy parasite standing before me. I felt no sadness, no lingering paternal affection, and certainly no regret for the devastating actions I had taken during the long, dark night. He genuinely believed that my decades of grueling sacrifice, my endless nights of stressful negotiations, and my immense corporate victories were simply unearned privileges that he was inherently entitled to harvest for his own superficial amusement. He was a deeply flawed, incredibly dangerous liability that needed to be permanently neutralized. I did not raise my voice to match his aggressive shouting. I simply reached down with my good hand and pressed the small plastic mechanical button located on the side railing of my hospital bed. The electric motor hummed quietly as the top half of my stiff mattress slowly raised upward, forcing my broken torso into a fully seated, highly dominant position. I ignored the sharp, stinging pain radiating aggressively through my cracked ribs. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us, my eyes locking onto his with the cold, lethal intensity of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. "I owe you absolutely nothing, Derek," I said, my voice dropping into a harsh, unforgiving whisper that carried the full, terrifying weight of my entire corporate empire. "I built this wealth with my own blood and sweat, and I will gladly burn every single penny of it to the ground before I let you steal another dime. And as of this morning, you own nothing." The suffocating silence following my declaration was absolute. Derek stood frozen by my hospital bed, his chest heaving with shallow breaths as the arrogant fire in his eyes gave way to creeping dread. He opened his mouth to demand the money he believed was his birthright, but I raised my hand to silence him. I was not finished dismantling his stolen reality. I reached across the tray table and picked up a slim folder Mitchell had placed there before their arrival. I held it out toward my son. When he refused to take it, I let the folder drop onto the blankets. The paper slid open, revealing freshly printed, legally binding eviction notices and asset seizure mandates. "Let me be perfectly clear about your current situation, Derek," I began, my voice carrying the detached precision of a surgeon. "Exactly 4 hours ago, while you and your wife were frantically begging for standby flight tickets in the crowded Aspen Airport terminal, a private security detail arrived at the main Highland Park property. I instructed them to change every exterior lock, disable the biometric gates, and revoke your neighborhood access codes. You no longer reside in that $3 million mansion. You do not own that house. You never owned that house. The deed has always rested firmly under the absolute control of my private trust. My security team packed your designer clothes, imported shoes, and lavish accessories into industrial black garbage bags. Those bags are sitting on the curb outside the main gate, waiting for the sanitation department to collect them." Stephanie let out a gasp, her hands flying to her pale face as the reality of her sudden homelessness crashed down upon her. She stumbled backward until her back hit the hospital wall. She was openly weeping, with genuine, profound terror. The elite socialite life she had ruthlessly funded with my stolen wealth was officially dead, entirely evaporated in a single morning. She looked at Derek with wide, panicked eyes, silently begging her husband to fix the monumental disaster he had carelessly orchestrated. But Derek was powerless, stripped of the unearned financial armor that had shielded him from consequence for his adult life. I shifted my gaze back to my son, watching the color drain from his face as he stared down at the legal documents on my bed. "But a house is merely a building, Derek." I continued smoothly, refusing to offer him a single second to recover his breath. "If you look closely at the second document in that stack, you will find the formal legal dissolution of your so-called software startup. The corporate entity has been permanently liquidated. The $15,000 monthly transfer protocol has been terminated. You no longer have an income, fake or otherwise. Furthermore, I have executed an immediate repossession mandate for both the Mercedes and the Porsche. The leasing agency tracked the vehicles down at the resort in Colorado and impounded them before sunrise. You do not have a house, you do not have a car, you do not have a company, and you do not have a single penny in your frozen bank accounts. You are completely cut off." The sheer magnitude of the destruction finally broke through Derek's paralyzed shock. His initial fear instantly mutated into a wild, explosive outrage. He lunged forward, slamming his fists violently down onto the metal railing of my hospital bed. The sudden impact rattled the intravenous pole beside me, but I did not flinch. "You are a monster," he screamed, his face contorted into an ugly sneer. "You are a terrible, selfish father. How could you possibly do this to your own flesh and blood? How could you throw your only son out onto the street like worthless garbage? You have hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in the bank. You could have just let us keep the house. You could have just let us keep the cars. It means nothing to you, but it is my entire life. You are a cold, heartless bastard, and I curse the day I was born to you." He was panting heavily, spittle flying from his lips as he hurled his toxic accusations. He desperately wanted me to feel the crushing weight of paternal guilt. He wanted me to mourn the destruction of our family bond and beg for his hollow forgiveness. But I felt nothing but a cold, profound clarity. I had spent decades tirelessly building a fortress to protect my family, only to realize I had been actively breeding a dangerous predator inside the gates. Stephanie collapsed onto a small visitor chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. Her loud, ugly sobs filled the heavy silence left in the wake of Derek's outburst. She was mourning the tragic loss of her luxurious spa retreats and secret offshore accounts. The parasitic pact they had carefully maintained was thoroughly dismantled, leaving them completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving realities of the real world. They had gambled my wealth and lost everything. Derek pushed himself away from the metal railing of my bed, his chest heaving with an erratic rhythm. He wiped his sweating forehead, trying desperately to salvage a shred of shattered pride. A malicious smirk slowly crept across his face, twisting his features into a mask of pure vindictive triumph. He looked down at me, his eyes burning with a renewed confidence. "You really think you won this war, do you not?" "Dad," Derek sneered, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "You think you can just snap your fingers and erase my entire life? You are nothing but a broken old man trapped in a hospital bed. I do not need your permission to take what is mine. I already took it. I filed the full power of attorney document with the county clerk exactly an hour before we boarded our flight to Aspen. It is completely legal and entirely binding. By tomorrow morning, the courts will officially declare you mentally unfit to manage your own affairs. I will be legally in charge of your entire estate, your corporate holdings, and every single bank account you possess. I am going to sell off your real estate empire piece by piece, and I am going to put you in the most miserable, restrictive, state-run facility I can possibly find. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life rotting in a lonely room, and I will be the one holding the master keys to your kingdom." I listened to his vicious, triumphant monologue without breaking my cold, steady stare. I did not attempt to hit the nurse call button or signal Mitchell to intervene. I simply watched my son lay all his final treacherous cards completely face up on the table. He truly believed he had executed the perfect corporate execution. I finally let a slow, dark smile spread directly across my face, a smile devoid of any paternal warmth or mercy. I slowly adjusted my position against the stiff hospital pillows, feeling the overwhelming weight of absolute victory settling deep into my bones. "I was genuinely hoping that you would mention the forged power of attorney today," I said very softly. The heavy wooden door to the private ensuite bathroom slowly creaked open, breaking the suffocating tension that had temporarily frozen the room. Mitchell stepped out from the shadowy interior, his tailored suit completely unwrinkled despite the grueling, sleepless night we had just endured. He moved with the slow, predatory grace of a seasoned hunter who had patiently waited in the blind for the perfect moment to strike. In his right hand, he casually held a thick stack of crisp white legal documents, the top page bearing the unmistakable heavy embossed seal of a federal judge. Derek instinctively took a half-step backward, his previous arrogant posture instantly collapsing as his eyes darted nervously toward the imposing attorney. Mitchell did not immediately speak. He took his time walking with deliberate, measured steps until he was standing directly beside my hospital bed, presenting a united, impenetrable front against my treacherous son and his panicking wife. He calmly adjusted his glasses, looking down at Derek with an expression of pure, unadulterated professional disgust. "You have made a catastrophic miscalculation." Derek Mitchell finally stated, his deep voice resonating with a terrifying absolute authority that seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "You foolishly assumed that your father was completely incapacitated, but you entirely failed to realize that his legal team operates independently of his physical condition." Mitchell raised the stack of documents, holding them up under the harsh fluorescent lights, so Derek could clearly read the bold black text printed across the top page. "What I hold in my hand is an emergency federal injunction, signed and fully executed by a senior district judge exactly 3 hours ago," Mitchell explained, delivering each word with lethal, methodical precision. "This injunction completely nullifies the fraudulent power of attorney you so proudly filed this morning. But the invalidation of your stolen authority is merely the smallest of your rapidly multiplying problems. You see Derek filing a legally binding medical proxy and financial power of attorney, while the victim is heavily incapacitated under the direct influence of surgical-grade narcotics, is not simply a minor civil dispute. It is a severe, highly punishable felony. You did not just forge a signature. You engaged in a premeditated, highly coordinated conspiracy to commit massive elder fraud, grand larceny, and corporate theft. Because you electronically transmitted those fraudulent documents across state lines to the county clerk while fleeing to Colorado, you have officially triggered multiple counts of federal wire fraud. You crossed a dangerous line that you can never uncross, and the federal government takes a profoundly unforgiving stance on criminals who weaponize the medical vulnerability of the elderly to steal their life savings. The last remaining traces of color rapidly drained from Derek's face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky white that matched the sterile hospital sheets covering my broken legs. His arrogant sneer was completely eradicated entirely, replaced by the wide, vacant stare of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on the collapsing trapdoor of a legal gallows. He opened his mouth to formulate a defense to spin another layer of pathetic lies, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He simply stood there, trembling violently, as the monumental weight of his actions began to crush his chest. Mitchell did not give him a single second to recover his shattered wits. He calmly reached down to the rolling tray table and picked up my secured electronic tablet. He tapped the glowing glass screen, instantly waking the device from its dormant state, and turned the high-resolution monitor directly toward my son. "I want you to watch this very closely," Derek Mitchell commanded, pressing his finger against the play icon. "I want you to see exactly how thoroughly you have destroyed your own life." The grainy black and white security footage from the hospital trauma corridor began to play in a continuous, unforgiving loop. Derek watched his own digital ghost nervously pacing outside my swinging medical doors. He watched the highly suspicious man in the pristine white coat approach him, handing over the digital scanner. He watched himself brutally force my limp, unconscious thumb against the glowing glass reader. A low, pathetic whimper escaped Derek's throat as the undeniable visual evidence of his ultimate betrayal played out right before his eyes. Mitchell mercilessly paused the video at the exact moment the corrupt notary turned toward the hidden ceiling camera. He zoomed in perfectly on the laminated identification badge, expanding the image until the state seal and the bold public notary title filled the entire screen. "We secured this footage yesterday afternoon," Mitchell continued, his tone entirely devoid of any mercy or compassion. "We have fully identified your corrupt accomplice. We know his name, we know his business address, and we know exactly how much stolen money you transferred into his hidden account to secure his illegal cooperation. The legal trap you so arrogantly thought you had set for your father has completely closed around your own neck. You built a guillotine for him, but you are the one who just placed your head on the chopping block." The physical reaction to this devastating realization was immediate and absolute. Derek's knees completely buckled beneath his weight, as if the invisible strings supporting his entire false existence had been violently severed. He collapsed heavily onto the hard linoleum floor, his expensive designer pants pooling around his ankles. He landed directly on top of the scattered glossy photographs of his young mistress, completely crushing her smiling face under his trembling kneecaps. "Dad." "Please," Derek sobbed, his voice breaking into a high, hysterical wail of absolute desperation. "You have to stop this. You have to call them off." I was out of my mind. The relentless stress of the corporate business world completely drove me to madness. You do not understand the overwhelming pressure I was under to succeed, to maintain the incredibly high standards you set for our family. I was drowning in expectations, constantly terrified that I would look like a massive failure in your eyes. I just needed a way to secure my future, to prove that I could manage the empire. I am so incredibly sorry, Dad. I swear I will do whatever it takes to make this right. I will go to a rehabilitation clinic. I will sign away all my future inheritance rights. Just please, I am begging you on my hands and knees, do not let them send me to a federal prison. I will not survive in there. I stared down at the pathetic, weeping creature, groveling on the floor of my recovery room. I listened to his frantic, cowardly attempts to blame his massive criminal enterprise on the stress of the business world, as if corporate pressure somehow justified paying a corrupt notary to steal a real estate empire from an unconscious man. He was fundamentally broken, entirely devoid of the basic moral foundation required to be a man, let alone a son. I kept my face perfectly still, refusing to offer him a single ounce of the paternal forgiveness he was so desperately hunting for. While Derek was completely lost in his loud hysterical breakdown, my eyes tracked the subtle, highly calculated movements happening in the far corner of the room. Stephanie had realized with absolute clarity that her husband was a rapidly sinking ship, and she had no intention of going down with him. She had stopped her fake crying and was slowly silently backing away from the visitor chair. She moved with the cautious, deliberate steps of a trapped animal, desperately trying to blend into the shadows and slide toward the exit without drawing my attention. She kept her wide, terrified eyes locked onto Mitchell, and me hoping that Derek's loud sobbing would provide enough auditory cover for her cowardly escape. She was planning to abandon her husband on the floor, slip out of the hospital, and run back to Dallas to try and salvage whatever hidden scraps of stolen jewelry she could carry in her oversized handbag. I did not speak. I simply let my cold gaze follow her slow retreat, watching as she closed the distance to the heavy wooden door. She reached her trembling hand backward, her perfectly manicured fingers blindly grasping for the cold brass doorknob. She finally felt the metal beneath her palm, a sudden wave of frantic relief briefly washing over her smeared face as she prepared to turn the handle and flee into the corridor. Before Stephanie could even apply an ounce of downward pressure on the brass knob, heavy wooden door forcefully swung inward, pushing her roughly back into the room. Nurse Sarah Jenkins stepped squarely into the doorway, her formidable presence entirely blocking the only path to freedom. Sarah crossed her muscular arms tightly over her chest, her jaw set in a rigid line of absolute uncompromising authority. She stared directly down at Stephanie, her eyes burning with a fierce protective loyalty to her patient. "Nobody leaves this room," Sarah stated, her voice slicing through Derek's pathetic sobbing like a sharp, heavy blade. The chilling command echoed against the sterile walls, permanently sealing the trap. Stephanie let out a short, terrified gasp, shrinking back from the unyielding nurse. At that exact moment, the heavy, rhythmic, unmistakable sound of thick, tactical boots began echoing loudly down the hospital corridor, marching with purposeful, terrifying speed directly toward my door. The sound of thick, tactical boots grew loud as they marched toward my recovery room. Derek spun his head toward the corridor, his eyes wide with panic. Nurse Sarah Jenkins remained planted in the doorway, an immovable guardian, until the figures reached the threshold. She stepped aside, allowing the arm of the law to flood into the confined space. Two imposing detectives dressed in dark suits entered first, their badges displayed. They were flanked by 4 uniformed Dallas police officers. The sterile atmosphere of the hospital ward was shattered by their overwhelming presence. Derek scrambled backward, his shoes slipping against the smooth linoleum floor until his back slammed against the plastered wall. The lead detective, a tall man with unforgiving eyes, stepped toward my trembling son. He did not introduce himself with polite pleasantries or offer an explanation for his arrival. He operated with a cold, mechanical efficiency that mirrored Mitchell's legal ruthlessness. Derek Richard Vance, the detective, announced, his deep voice projecting across the room like a heavy iron bell. "You are officially under arrest." The detective did not wait for Derek to process the statement. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a pair of metallic handcuffs that gleamed menacingly under the bright ceiling lights. "You are being formally charged with multiple counts of felony wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and a coordinated criminal conspiracy to commit elder abuse through the malicious forgery of legal medical documents." Derek let out a pathetic gasp, shaking his head in absolute denial. "No," he stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure of his reality. "There is a massive mistake. You do not understand what is happening here. I am the sole heir to this corporate estate. You cannot march in here and arrest me without a valid warrant. My father is just heavily medicated and confused." The lead detective did not blink at the frantic lies spilling from my son's mouth. He reached inside his jacket and produced a stack of folded legal papers. "We have an emergency federal warrant signed exactly 3 hours ago," the detective stated flatly. "We have the complete security footage of your illegal transaction with a corrupt notary, and we possess digital transcripts confirming your financial extortion network. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Derek refused to comply. He kept his back pressed desperately against the hospital wall, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. The 2 uniformed police officers surged forward, their patience evaporated. They grabbed Derek by his shoulders, spinning his rigid body around with swift force. Derek let out a loud, humiliating yelp as they pinned his chest against the hard plaster. The lead detective grabbed my son's wrists, pulling them together behind his back. The sharp metallic clicking sound of the heavy silver bracelets ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent room with undeniable finality. Derek writhed against the officers, frantically turning his head to look directly at me over his shoulder. The arrogant entitlement that had defined his entire adult life was completely gone, replaced by the sheer terror of a spoiled child who had pushed the boundaries far too far. "Dad!" Derek screamed, genuine tears of panic streaming down his flushed face. "Please, Dad. You have to tell them to stop. You cannot let them take me to a federal prison. I will never survive in a place like that. I am your only son. You have to use your corporate connections to fix this. Call your lawyers. Pay whatever they want. You have to save me. You always save me." I sat perfectly still in my elevated hospital bed, my breathing steady and even. I looked directly into his desperate, weeping eyes. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer a single ounce of paternal comfort. I simply gave him an icy, unreadable stare that contained absolutely no mercy, no warmth, and no forgiveness. He stared back at me, searching frantically for the loving father he had ruthlessly exploited for the past 3 years. But that foolish, trusting man was dead, murdered by the devastating betrayal of his own flesh and blood. Derek finally understood that I was the architect of his total destruction. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and his legs completely gave out. The uniformed officers had to physically hold him upright by his armpits as he openly sobbed, completely broken and entirely defeated. The lead detective stepped right into my son's line of sight, completely blocking me from his view. "You have the right to remain silent." The detective began reciting the Miranda warning with a practiced, monotonous rhythm that offered absolutely no comfort. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." As the detective continued to read my son his legal rights, I shifted my attention to the far corner of the room. Stephanie was standing completely frozen near the adjoining bathroom door, watching her wealthy husband being brutally reduced to a crying, handcuffed criminal. Her panic was rapidly mutating into a desperate survival instinct. She realized her ship was sinking, and she needed a life raft immediately. Stephanie slowly stepped away from the wall, her hands raised in a placating gesture. She completely ignored her sobbing husband, stepping deliberately away from his handcuffed form. "Officers, please," Stephanie said, her voice shaking, but laced with a calculated determination. "You have to listen to me. I had absolutely nothing to do with this corporate conspiracy. He told me he was building a legitimate software company. He hid the illegal offshore accounts from me. I am just a devoted wife who was manipulated by a pathological liar." She pointed a trembling finger directly at Derek, callously throwing the man she loved straight to the hungry wolves. "I know exactly where he hides his personal digital ledgers," she continued, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "I know the names of the private bank managers he bribes. I am completely willing to testify against him in federal court. I will give you everything you need to secure a conviction. Just please let me walk out of here." Derek stopped crying for a brief second, looking at his wife with an expression of pure shock. He never expected his partner in crime to actively volunteer to be the star witness for the prosecution. Stephanie refused to look at him, keeping her wide, pleading eyes locked firmly onto the second financial detective standing near the hospital bed. She took a slow, cautious step toward the open doorway, desperately trying to distance herself from the radioactive criminal standing in the center of the room. "I will cooperate fully with the district attorney," Stephanie promised, her hand slowly reaching out toward the heavy wooden doorframe. The second detective slowly turned his head to look at her. He reached into his own tailored jacket and calmly pulled out a matching pair of heavy silver handcuffs. He offered her a grim, joyless smile that completely shattered her desperate illusion of safety. "That will not be necessary, ma'am," the detective stated smoothly. He did not lower his intense gaze as he stepped deliberately toward the shrinking woman, confidently holding the heavy silver handcuffs up directly under the harsh fluorescent lights. You see, the district attorney already has a star witness for this particular case, the detective explained, his deep voice echoing with grim, uncompromising authority. We have a massive mountain of meticulously documented digital evidence perfectly provided by your father-in-law and his legal counsel. We do not need your testimony because you are not a victim in this scenario. You are a highly active, fully complicit criminal accomplice. Stephanie let out a sharp gasp, pressing her back so hard against the bathroom doorframe that her knuckles turned stark white. She vigorously shook her head frantically, her long hair falling across her smeared face. I did not do anything, she pleaded, her voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. I just bought expensive clothes and went on vacations. I do not know anything about a medical proxy. You cannot arrest me for simply being married to a criminal. The lead detective let out a short, humorless laugh. That might be an effective defense strategy if you had actually stayed out of the financial logistics, he countered sharply. Unfortunately for you, we have every single text message you ever sent to your husband. We have the transcripts where you explicitly demand money in direct exchange for your silence regarding his affairs. We have the routing numbers proving you personally authorized the transfer of stolen corporate funds into hidden offshore portfolios. Therefore, you are formally under arrest for severe felony extortion, grand money laundering, and criminal conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The second detective moved forward with startling speed. He grabbed Stephanie by her trembling wrists, forcefully pulling her hands away from her chest and twisting them behind her back. The cold steel ratcheted tightly around her wrists with a sharp, undeniable click. The physical sensation of the cold metal biting into her skin completely shattered whatever fragile remnants of sanity Stephanie had left. The polished, elegant socialite persona she had carefully cultivated instantly disintegrated entirely, replaced by a feral, unhinged desperation. She completely lost her mind. Stephanie threw her head back and unleashed a deafening, piercing scream that rattled the medical monitors surrounding my bed. She began to thrash violently against the detective, kicking her expensive boots backward in a frantic attempt to strike his shins. "Get your hands off me," she shrieked, her voice tearing through the sterile air like jagged glass. "I belong in Highland Park. I do not belong in a jail cell." She twisted her upper body, fighting with the frantic energy of a cornered animal, but the seasoned detective easily absorbed her chaotic movements, holding her firmly in place. When she realized she could not physically escape the unyielding grip of the law, she immediately turned her absolute, unfiltered wrath directly toward her handcuffed husband. "You stupid, pathetic loser!" Stephanie screamed, spit flying from her lips, as she glared at Derek with pure, concentrated hatred. "This is entirely your fault. You promised me a perfect life. You promised me an empire. You told me you had every single angle perfectly covered that your father would never figure out a thing. You dragged me down into your sloppy mess, and now you have completely ruined my life. I hate you, Derek." Derek, still openly weeping against the plaster wall, looked at his furious wife with an expression of profound, shattered disbelief. The toxic pact they had forged over my stolen wealth had completely imploded, leaving them with absolutely nothing but mutual resentment and terror. They were turning on each other like starving wolves, desperately trying to tear each other down to save themselves. The illusion of their perfect marriage was violently ripped away, revealing the hollow, rotting core of their relationship. I watched their spectacular breakdown from my elevated bed, maintaining my cold, detached silence. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the woman screaming obscenities across my room. She was finally facing the severe, unforgiving consequences of her own boundless greed. The lead detective quickly lost his patience with the chaotic, screaming spectacle unfolding inside the small recovery room. "That is more than enough," the detective commanded, his deep voice slicing sharply through Stephanie's hysterical rant. He nodded firmly to the uniformed police officers waiting near the doorway to secure them in the transport vehicles. The officers immediately moved in, gripping Derek and Stephanie tightly by their upper arms and physically dragging them toward the exit. Derek continued to sob loudly, his shoulders slumping heavily as he completely surrendered to the physical force of the police. He dragged his expensive leather shoes across the linoleum, casting one final begging look back at my hospital bed. I simply stared right through him, my eyes as cold and hard as glacial ice. Stephanie, however, refused to go quietly. She continued to kick and scream, cursing the detectives, cursing her husband, and cursing my name as they forcefully wrestled her through the heavy wooden doorframe. The dramatic, violent departure spilled directly out into the busy hospital corridor. I could clearly hear the chaotic commotion echoing loudly down the sterile hallway. Nurses abandoned their medical carts, doctors stepped out of adjoining rooms, and recovering patients peered through their open doors to witness the unbelievable spectacle. My son and his wife were being publicly paraded through the trauma ward in heavy silver handcuffs, their overlapping screams of panic and rage completely shattering the quiet morning atmosphere. The profound humiliation of their exit was absolute. They had spent years pretending to be the absolute pinnacle of Dallas high society, obsessed with their flawless public image. Now they were being forcefully dragged away like common street thugs, their reputations permanently destroyed in front of dozens of shocked witnesses. The frantic clicking of Stephanie's boots and her furious, unhinged wailing slowly faded into the distance, growing fainter and fainter as the police marched them toward the heavy elevators and entirely out of my life. Nurse Sarah Jenkins stepped back into the private recovery room, her facial expression completely calm and thoroughly professional. She reached out and firmly grasped the brass handle of the heavy wooden door, pulling it shut with a solid, resounding click. The instant the metal latch engaged, a sudden dead silence descended over the isolated room. The sharp transition from chaotic, screaming violence to absolute stillness was incredibly jarring. The only sound remaining was the soft, rhythmic hum of the digital heart monitor operating quietly beside my bed. Mitchell stood near the foot of my mattress, his posture immaculate and his tailored suit completely unruffled by the surrounding madness. He slowly adjusted his glasses, his sharp eyes intently scanning my face with genuine concern. "Are you all right, Richard?" Mitchell asked, his deep voice incredibly quiet and gentle. I did not answer my trusted attorney. I slowly lowered my gaze, looking down at my hands resting flat against the stark white hospital blankets. My fingers were trembling uncontrollably in the wake of the brutal confrontation. I had successfully won the war, but I had effectively lost my only family. 2 agonizing months slowly bled away before the trauma surgeons finally signed the discharge papers, allowing me to permanently leave the sterile confines of the hospital. Returning to my sprawling Dallas estate should have felt like a triumphant victory, but the massive empty house only amplified the profound silence that had settled heavily over my newly isolated life. The physical toll of the catastrophic collision still lingered deep within my bones. I was now entirely reliant on a thick wooden cane forcing my shattered femur to bear the heavy weight of my battered frame. Nurse Sarah Jenkins had transitioned from my hospital guardian to my strict live and physical therapist. She relentlessly pushed me through hours of grueling, excruciating rehabilitation exercises in the sunlit conservatory every single morning. She completely ignored my harsh grunts of pain and my dark, foul moods, demanding absolute compliance with the medical recovery protocol. I respected her unwavering dedication. The searing agony radiating through my healing joints was a constant grounding reminder that I had survived the brutal assassination attempt on my entire existence. I was alive, and I was in absolute control of my physical domain once again. During the quiet, lonely afternoons, I would retreat to the heavy leather chair, positioned behind my massive oak desk in the private study. The vast mahogany-lined room felt unnervingly cavernous, without the familiar chaotic interruptions of family life. I would sit in the stillness for hours, methodically reading the sensationalized newspaper headlines scattered across my immaculate desk. The local media had mercilessly feasted on the scandalous, highly public downfall of my treacherous son and his glamorous, manipulative wife. The financial fraud trial was officially scheduled to begin in 3 weeks, and the federal prosecutors were aggressively pursuing maximum prison sentences. Derek was sitting in a federal detention center, utterly stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his unearned corporate arrogance. Stephanie had been entirely denied bail, legally deemed a severe flight risk after investigators uncovered a hidden cache of stolen funds she had attempted to quickly wire to a foreign account just hours before her dramatic arrest. As I stared at their printed names in the black ink of the newspaper columns, I wrestled violently with the immense suffocating grief of a father. I was not mourning the two bitter, greedy criminals currently rotting in federal custody. I was deeply mourning the tragic death of the son I genuinely thought I had raised. I missed the innocent, bright-eyed boy who used to eagerly follow me around the construction sites of my very first commercial properties. I missed the illusion of the perfect family I had spent 4 decades working tirelessly to build and fiercely protect. But beneath the heavy layer of lingering sadness, my heart remained completely steadfast in the absolute necessity of my ruthless actions. They were dangerous, calculating predators who had callously orchestrated my permanent imprisonment in a state facility to fund their hollow, luxurious fantasies. I had not destroyed my family. I had simply removed a malignant, parasitic tumor before it could completely consume the healthy host. The emotional toll was undeniably brutal, but the profound clarity of my survival left absolutely no room for toxic regret. On the bleak, overcast morning of my late wife's birthday, I ordered my private driver to take me directly to the quiet, manicured grounds of the northern cemetery. The brisk autumn wind bit sharply through my thick wool overcoat as I slowly navigated the gentle incline of the grassy hill, leaning heavily on my polished wooden cane with every deliberate, measured step. I finally stopped in front of the elegant marble headstone bearing Mary's beloved name. The polished stone was cold and pristine, completely untouched by the massive destructive hurricane that had recently obliterated the living remnants of our shared legacy. I stood completely alone on the quiet hillside, staring down at the engraved letters of her name, and I spoke to her with a harsh, unsentimental honesty that offered absolutely no comfortable illusions. "I fixed the terrible mistake we made, Mary," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the empty, rustling trees. "We gave him absolutely everything. We handed him the entire world on a silver platter, shielding him from every single hardship and consequence, believing that our boundless generosity would somehow breed a decent, honorable man. But we only succeeded in building a greedy, entitled monster who firmly believed he had the absolute right to literally step over my dead body to get what he wanted. I stopped being his safety net, Mary. I completely severed the endless financial pipeline, and I watched him reveal his true, treacherous face without a single ounce of genuine remorse. I had to utterly destroy the life we built for him to protect the empire we created together. It was the hardest, most devastating choice I have ever had to make in my entire life, but I finally stopped enabling the rot that was slowly destroying our name. I slowly lifted my heavy gaze away from the smooth marble headstone, looking out over the rolling green hills toward the sprawling, magnificent Dallas skyline dominating the distant horizon. The towering glass and steel skyscrapers pierced the gloomy clouds, reflecting the pale morning light with a cold, intimidating brilliance. I owned a significant portion of that magnificent skyline. I possessed massive commercial complexes, luxury residential towers, and incredibly lucrative development contracts that stretched across the entire state. My vast wealth was secure, completely protected, behind an impenetrable fortress of aggressive litigation and bulletproof legal trusts. Yet as I stared at the towering monuments of my immense corporate success, a stark, hollow realization settled deeply into my chest. The sprawling empire I had spent a lifetime building now possessed absolutely no legitimate heir. The bloodline ended with my broken body. If I suddenly passed away, the state would aggressively step in to legally dismantle my life's work, easily auctioning off the commercial properties to eager corporate vultures and merciless rivals who had spent decades patiently waiting for me to show a single sign of weakness. I firmly gripped the smooth, curved handle of my wooden cane, feeling the familiar, unyielding fire of my lifelong ambition roaring back to life deep within my chest. I absolutely refused to allow my massive legacy to simply fade away into forgotten ashes or fall into the greedy hands of completely undeserving strangers. I reached down into the deep pocket of my heavy overcoat and pulled out my secured cellular phone. I completely ignored the lingering, stinging pain in my injured hand as I quickly dialed Mitchell's direct private number. He answered the secure line almost immediately, his tone sharp, focused, and ready for battle. "Mitchell," I calmly stated, my voice echoing with a renewed, extremely dangerous clarity across the silent cemetery. "I am going to explicitly need you to assemble the entire executive board and completely clear my schedule for the rest of the year. We are establishing a truly massive philanthropic foundation to permanently lock down the entire estate, and I have a highly critical final directive that will completely and permanently rewrite the entire financial future of this massive, sprawling city." Mitchell arrived at my estate less than 48 hours after that phone call, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my son's financial future. He walked into my quiet study with a solemn expression, pulling out thick stacks of freshly drafted legal documents and spreading them meticulously across the wide mahogany desk. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the paperwork that would permanently sever my bloodline from my wealth. We did not engage in any polite small talk, and we absolutely did not exchange any useless pleasantries. Mitchell knew exactly what I needed today, and he operated with the ruthless, highly calculated surgical efficiency that I always demanded from him. I leaned forward in my leather chair, grasping the heavy gold fountain pen that Mary had given me for our 20th wedding anniversary. With slow, deliberate strokes, I signed my name to the ultimate disinheritance clause. The legally binding documents explicitly stripped Derek of every single financial right, trust fund, and inheritance claim he had ever possessed or anticipated. I formally instructed Mitchell to include an ironclad, uncontestable provision stating that regardless of the outcome of his upcoming federal trial, regardless of any potential plea deals or future appeals, Derek would never receive a single penny from my estate. He was entirely cut off, erased from the financial ledger of my life with the simple, deliberate stroke of a golden pen. Mitchell watched me sign the final page, his expression carefully neutral, but I could see a profound respect in his eyes. He gathered the documents, placing them back into his briefcase with a sharp click that sounded like the closing of a heavy vault door. The deed was done. The parasitic tumor had been permanently and cleanly excised. With the incredibly toxic anchor of my traitorous son finally cut loose from my life, I was immediately presented with a truly monumental task. I possessed a sprawling real estate empire and hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid assets, and I absolutely refused to let that incredibly massive wealth simply evaporate into the waiting hands of greedy corporate competitors or distant opportunistic relatives I barely knew. I was fundamentally unwilling to leave my legacy to an individual. I was going to leave my legacy to a profound living purpose. Over the next several weeks, my massive quiet study was transformed into a bustling command center. I instructed Mitchell to begin scheduling highly confidential interviews with local community leaders, directors of grassroots charitable organizations, dedicated social workers, and visionary urban planners who actually cared deeply about the struggling neighborhoods of Dallas. I spent hours sitting behind my desk, listening to passionate men and women present their desperate proposals for affordable housing initiatives, community medical clinics, and robust educational scholarship funds. I scrutinized their financial projections with the same ruthless, demanding eye I used for my commercial real estate acquisitions. I wanted to build a colossal, self-sustaining philanthropic foundation that would aggressively invest my wealth directly back into the city that had initially made me rich. I was no longer building skyscrapers to glorify my own name. I was setting the complex structural framework to build community centers, fund struggling public schools, and provide massive zero-interest business loans to honest, hardworking families who simply needed a truly fair chance to succeed. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering, but for the first time in decades, I genuinely felt a profound, incredibly burning excitement for the ultimate future of my hard-earned money and the positive impact it could make. As the structural plans for the foundation rapidly took shape, a truly profound shift began to naturally occur within my own physical and mental state. The grueling daily physical therapy sessions with Sarah were undeniably still incredibly painful, but the agonizing burn radiating through my healing leg muscles no longer felt like a miserable, endless punishment. Instead, the sharp pain transformed completely into a motivating, highly tangible reminder of my daily physical progress. I was steadily regaining my lost strength, entirely shedding the temporary physical weakness that Derek had so desperately and maliciously tried to weaponize against me in that hospital bed. I began walking through the vast corridors of my estate with a renewed commanding stride, relying less on the heavy wooden cane and more on my own restored balance. The crushing, suffocating weight that had rested on my chest since Mary passed away was finally gone. For years, I had been blindly carrying the enormous, exhausting burden of maintaining the perfect family illusion, constantly pouring my energy and resources into a son who only viewed me as an obstacle to his own greed. By completely purging the toxic parasites from my daily existence, I had inadvertently saved my own soul. The massive, sprawling house was undeniably quiet during the long evenings, but the heavy silence was no longer lonely or remotely oppressive. It was deeply and beautifully peaceful. I woke up every morning feeling genuinely unburdened, my mind completely clear and intensely focused on the massive philanthropic empire I was rapidly bringing to life. I was no longer the tragic, betrayed victim of a cruel corporate conspiracy. I was a survivor who had successfully reclaimed absolute control over his own destiny. On a particularly cold, gray Tuesday morning, I was sitting alone in my study, carefully reviewing a dense architectural blueprint for a massive new pediatric medical clinic I was personally funding in the Southern District. The heavy polished oak doors to my private office clicked open, and Sarah quietly stepped into the warm room, holding a small stack of the daily morning mail. She placed the letters gently onto the corner of my mahogany desk, offering a small, polite smile before silently retreating back into the hallway. I reached out and sifted through the generic business envelopes until my hand stopped abruptly on a cheap, plain white envelope. The return address printed in the top left corner bore the stark, unmistakable stamp of the Federal County Detention Center. Below the harsh government seal, scrawled in a frantic, trembling handwriting, I recognized immediately was Derek's name. I stared down at the cheap paper envelope for a long, incredibly heavy moment of contemplation. I knew exactly what pathetic excuses were hidden inside those folded pages. It would be a pathetic, tear-stained letter, begging for a defense lawyer, begging for a fraction of paternal mercy, begging for one final, unearned second chance. I did not feel a single flicker of anger, nor did I feel any lingering sadness. I simply felt absolutely nothing. I picked up the cheap envelope, gripping it lightly between my fingers. I slowly stood up from my leather chair, leaning my weight onto my cane, and walked deliberately across the plush carpet toward the massive stone fireplace burning brightly on the far side of the room. I stood before the crackling flames, feeling the intense heat washing over my face. Without breaking the fragile seal, and without reading a single desperate, whining word of his hollow, meaningless apologies, I simply opened my fingers and deliberately dropped the letter directly into the roaring, consuming fire. The crisp paper quickly blackened and curled, consumed by the intense heat in a matter of seconds. I watched the bright orange flames eagerly devour Derek's desperate pleas, reducing the final remnants of his toxic influence into nothing more than weightless gray ash that drifted up the dark chimney. The physical destruction of that letter represented the ultimate, irreversible conclusion of my past life. I turned my back on the warm hearth and walked to my desk, my mind entirely focused on the massive work that lay ahead. I had a new empire to build. Over the next 14 months, the Mary Caldwell Foundation grew from an ambitious blueprint into a formidable living reality. I poured an unprecedented amount of my liquid capital into establishing a highly aggressive, brilliantly staffed legal defense division, specifically dedicated to protecting vulnerable senior citizens. I remembered exactly how terrifying it felt to lie helpless in a hospital bed while predators attempted to legally hijack my existence. I made absolutely certain that no elderly person in Dallas would ever have to face that horrific nightmare alone. We hired the most relentless, razor-sharp attorneys Mitchell could find, offering entirely free legal representation to elderly victims of financial fraud, medical proxy abuse, and familial extortion. We aggressively dismantled fraudulent trusts, prosecuted abusive caretakers, and recovered millions in stolen life savings. But protecting the vulnerable was only half of my ultimate vision. To truly honor Mary's memory, I needed to actively build the kind of honorable, hard-working future we had originally hoped to create through our son. The foundation launched a massive, fully funded mentorship and vocational scholarship program aimed directly at the underprivileged youth of our city. I did not want to hand out easy charity. I wanted to forge strong character. The program was designed with incredibly rigorous standards, demanding strict discipline, unwavering dedication, and absolute personal accountability. We provided access to elite trade schools, university scholarships, and direct corporate apprenticeships, but the students had to earn every single inch of their progress through pure, undeniable hard work. I personally oversaw the implementation of these demanding programs, spending my days walking the halls of our newly constructed community centers. My leg had healed incredibly well under Sarah's unyielding regimen, allowing me to discard the wooden cane entirely. I moved through the bustling facilities with a profound sense of purpose, engaging directly with the young men and women who were tirelessly fighting to escape the crushing cycle of poverty. I watched them arrive early, stay late, and push themselves beyond their perceived limits to grasp the opportunities my wealth had provided. They were hungry for success, completely devoid of the sickening, arrogant entitlement that had entirely poisoned my own son. The true depth of this monumental transformation crystallized for me on a bright, perfectly clear afternoon in early May. I was sitting in the front row of the Foundation's grand auditorium, attending the inaugural graduation ceremony for our first cohort of vocational scholars. The massive room was absolutely packed with proud, weeping parents and fiercely determined young adults dressed in crisp graduation gowns. I watched intently as a young man named Jamal approached the wooden podium to deliver the valedictorian address. He had grown up in the most neglected district of the city, working night shifts to support his younger siblings before our program identified his raw, untapped potential. Jamal stood before the quiet crowd, his voice resonating with deep, genuine gratitude. He spoke eloquently about the brutal hardships he had faced, the grueling hours of study, and the profound, life-changing impact of an organization that simply demanded his absolute best. When he looked directly at me and publicly thanked the Foundation for believing in him, I felt a heavy, unfamiliar warmth bloom deep inside my chest. I looked at the incredible young men and women sitting in the front rows, their eyes shining with bright, hard-earned pride. It was in that exact moment I finally realized a powerful, undeniable truth. Blood does not automatically create a family. Shared genetics do not guarantee loyalty, respect, or fundamental human decency. True family is actively forged in the crucible of mutual respect, built entirely upon a foundation of genuine gratitude and reciprocal effort. I had spent decades blinding myself to my son's monstrous flaws, simply because he carried my last name, desperately trying to purchase his character with an endless stream of unearned wealth. But sitting in that crowded auditorium, completely surrounded by the resilient, honorable youth my legacy was actively shaping, I realized I had finally found the worthy heirs I had always desired. They were not inheriting my money to fund a life of lazy, parasitic luxury. They were inheriting the tools to forge their own magnificent destinies. The grand graduation ceremony finally concluded with thunderous, endlessly echoing applause, a truly beautiful, triumphant sound that seemed to permanently wash away all the lingering dark shadows of my past traumas. I proudly shook hands with the deeply ecstatic graduates, offering my sincere, heartfelt congratulations and intimately witnessing the pure, unadulterated joy radiating directly from their incredibly proud families. For the first time since my beloved Mary passed away, my heavy heart felt truly, completely whole again, beautifully and permanently repaired by the incredibly profound, absolutely undeniable meaning of my entirely new reality. Now, as I sit quietly on the sweeping back porch of my grand estate, watching the vibrant sunset paint the Texas sky in strokes of gold, I feel an absolute, unshakable peace. I hold a heavy crystal glass filled with a rare vintage scotch, the rich aroma mingling perfectly with the cool evening breeze. The vast house behind me is silent, but it is a comfortable, triumphant silence. I am a man who survived the ultimate betrayal by the very people I was always supposed to trust the most. I faced the absolute darkest depths of human greed and refused to let it destroy my spirit. Instead, I gathered the shattered pieces of my broken life and forged a massive living legacy that no greedy heir could ever possibly corrupt. I raise my glass toward the setting sun, offering a silent, heartfelt toast to Mary, completely confident that she is now smiling down on the magnificent empire we finally managed to build correctly. Generosity without strict boundaries is not love. It is the slow creation of a parasite. As parents, our natural instinct is to give our children the entire world, hoping it will make their lives easier than ours was. But when we entirely remove the struggle, we often remove their character. Respect and gratitude cannot be bought with monthly allowances. They must be earned through hardship and consequence. Never let the fear of losing your family blind you to the reality of who they have become. True family protects you when you are vulnerable. They do not prey on your weakness. If Richard's story truly resonated with you today, hit the like button and subscribe for more intense life stories. Have you ever had to set a painful boundary with a toxic family member? Share your specific experience in the comments below. I read every single one. See you next time.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame, light my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, and every step I take, and every time I choose to stand, when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain through every triumph, every